Welcome back to Let's Review It and part 4 of my Aprilia RS125 build. There's 3 episodes before this. If you haven't seen those, you probably want to watch those first. So lots has happened in the last week, so I'm just going to dive straight into it. As you can see, we've actually got a bike again. Last time I saw you guys, it was a little more than a frame and an engine. So whole front end has been completely rebuilt now. So all new levers, reconditioned top yoke, changed the oil in the Fuchs, so I'm going to show you how to do that. Reinstalled the reconditioned brakes, new brake pad seals, and bled the brakes through, so I'm going to show you how to do that. Reinstalled the power valve, the reconditioned exhaust, new coolant, reinstalled the radiator, bled the system through, so again, show you how to do all of that. Replaced a couple of seals and bits along the way, so I'll show you that. Filled this back up with 2-stroke oil. Bled the system through to get rid of any air in the oil system, so I'll show you how to do that. Reinstalled the rear wheel. Noticed there was a problem with the chain roller, so I've got to sort that out. Reinstalled all the back end, bled the rear brake through, which was a real pain in the arse. Fueled it back up, and boom, we've got our first start up, and I'm really pleased to say that it started first time on the button and it runs beautifully, so really happy so far. So yeah, let's get into it. So I decided after the last video I'd paint the exhaust, like I said, with this Hammerite satin finish metal paint, so it's come out quite nice. But one thing I did notice was how much sealant this guy had used on the exhaust for some reason. It didn't have a proper gasket, and it had formed like a bung in the exhaust that was making it run badly. So I put a new gasket on the exhaust. I'm going to install this part first. It just makes it easier to put back on, but you might want to use some exhaust sealant to slide the actual exhaust back onto the manifold. I found it to be stubborn at best. So once you've got the manifold back on, then obviously you can put the spring clips back on. If you've got a spring puller, that's the best way. You can use some needle nose pliers, but be prepared to lose part of your knuckle. And then of course you just need to bolt the exhaust back on underneath. And at this point I realized that actually someone had sold me the wrong pillion pegs, and so I couldn't get them to marry up with the exhaust. So if you want a set of pillion pegs that have been reconditioned, please give me a shout, but I am on the lookout for a proper set of pillion pegs to marry up with my Arrow exhaust. Next I'm going to refit the radiator back to its original mounting. So it just sits in the cradle there on the rubber bungs as I showed you last time. You're obviously going to need to refit the lower hose with the hose clip and also the top hose, making sure you apply the hose clip. You can see the bleed nut just on the top of the radiator there if you need it to release some air later on. A couple of you guys asked me last time where you actually bleed the water out of the system, and you can see it just here. It's an Allen key bolt that you need to remove to release all the water, but I've obviously already done that. Next up, I'm going to refill the expansion tank. First of all, I'll need to release the bleed valve on the top here to allow the air to drain out. I'm just using a generic Motocool Motul product that I paid about, but it's about a tenner I think. The system should take just under a litre. Q homemade funnel, made out of a Coke bottle of course. Just going to loosen off the bleed nipple on the top here. As you start to fill the liquid back up, it might take a little while for it to actually take out of the expansion chamber. What you need to do is to continuously fill bit by bit and squeeze the air out of the pipes. You'll see all the air bubbling out, and you'll see it coming out of the top of the bleed nipple as well. If you can't get all of the air out and you're struggling to get all of your 1 litre in there, you might need to bleed the system down later once you've run it up and got a bit of temperature in the bike. So I've cleaned up the top yoke as best I can. There's still a few scratches on it, but not a lot you can do about that. So I'm just going to go ahead and refit it using the nut that I basically sheared off in the last episode, just temporarily. I've actually got a new one, but I just don't want to scratch it yet. So I'm going to go ahead and start reassembling the switch gear, starting with the ignition barrel, since that's the easiest. One thing I thought was worth pointing out about the switch gear is that they've got locator pegs, so they can be a little bit fiddly, but that essentially stops them from rolling around on the bar. And reconnecting the choke cable can be a little bit difficult, so you need to make sure that you locate that, then temporarily just, you know, fit them back on the bike and check that that cable still operates, because that could be a little bit nasty to go away and do again later on. So I'm going to go and fit the both the clutch and brake levers. I'm not going to do them up really tight because I'm going to adjust those again when, you know, I finally get the bike back on the road to suit my my own comfort. So we're just going to finish these up, and then we're going to go and look at the front suspension. So I've repainted the bottom of the fork legs. That was simple enough, and I'm going to go ahead and change the oil. So you're going to need a measuring jug, and of course you're going to need to take the tops of the forks off. It's easier to loosen these off while they're in the triple clamps. Probably should have mentioned that earlier. Once you've got them off, make a note of the seal. If that seal on the top of the nut here is damaged, you should definitely replace that, although mine doesn't look too bad. Next up, you're going to need to take these two retaining clips off the top and then the base plate underneath it to be able to get the oil out. Next up, you can tip the fork upside down, push down, and pump the shaft a few times, and eventually all of the oil should come out. You should see around about 400 to 410 millilitres in the measuring jug afterwards. And obviously mine has been in there for some time because it's a milky brown colour. Next up, some 10 weight fork oil. Aprilia recommend, I think that you use between 7 and 15, but I'm going for a middleweight, 10 weight from Fuchs. And the fork should take 430 millilitres in each leg, so make sure you measure that out accurately. So pull the shaft all the way out of the fork leg and go ahead and pour your 430 millilitres of oil into the fork. As you're pouring it in, you may need to pump the shaft up and down to get the fork to take all of the oil. Next, you're going to replace the base plate and the retaining clips on the top. At this point, the shaft might slide right down to the bottom. It doesn't really matter. What the retaining clips do at the top are create an air suction seal, and you'll feel it suck itself to the base plate when you lift the shaft back up again. So as the retaining clips actually seat themselves, all of a sudden you'll feel like an airlock in the fork. Then you can lift the fork off the ground and it will fully extend itself. Only once the fork has fully extended itself has all of the air been sucked out of the system, and then you can go ahead and you can put the cap back on. Remember that you should replace this seal ideally if you can, or if you need to. Okay, so I am now going to go ahead and put my fork legs back in. At the moment it doesn't matter what way round they go because you'll be able to twist them around before you put the front wheel back in. Personally, I would recommend that you grease the triple clamps before pushing the fork back into it, because they've got a perforated edge. They can be quite difficult to push back in. Sometimes it's better to get someone else to help you. Finally, I'm putting in my new top nut and I'm going to tighten it up to the desired torque settings. Right, so I'm going to go ahead and reinstall the front wheel. So this is the speedo drive that I'm just reinserting here, and I'm just going to pop the axle back in to hold that. We're going to go ahead and refit the calipers and bleed the brake system through. So the exact opposite of extracting the front wheel. Make sure all of your spacers are back in and that they're round the right way, and make sure that your fork legs are twisted round the right way before you reinstall the wheel. And then obviously just put the retaining nut in and tighten up to the right tension, and then just make sure that you pop the fork bolts back in and tighten them up. So these are my nicely reconditioned calipers, new seals and all. I've got myself a new banjo and I've got myself some new washers as well. So we're just going to go ahead and reinstall that. Got myself some brake pads, got myself some you know, brake bleeding kit, and you are going to need some brake cleaner for this because it's a really messy job. Again, remember, like I said last time, brake fluid is nasty stuff, so you don't want to get it on any of your new paintwork. So I'm going to go ahead and put some of this Worth grease on the back of the brake pads. This helps to dissipate the heat, and ultimately it stops the brake pads from squealing like a pig after a few thousand miles. So probably don't need quite as much as I've actually applied here, but you know, I live for excess, so I'm just going to smear this over the back. Be careful not to get this grease all over the front of the pad, otherwise you'll lose any kind of adhesion. And make sure you wash off any of this stuff if it gets on your hands, because you don't want to smear this all over the pads or any other part of the bike while you're reinstalling. So once you've reinstalled your pads, you can just slide them back in. They will just sit there quite nicely. There's a retaining clip that fits just over the top of the pads there. You can see that there's a dip in the middle that needs to be facing downwards when the caliper is fitted. And that will sit just in the 2 grooves on the top of the brake pads there, and that will allow you to insert the pin and then the retaining clip on the back of the pin to make sure that it doesn't fall out. And you can already see what I was talking about. This grease just gets everywhere, so clean that off with some brake cleaner. So your pads should be nicely spaced. That should allow you to push your caliper back on, realign with the bolt holes, and obviously tighten up the bolts to make sure that the caliper's on. Make sure you torque this up properly. If it was me, I would put some Loctite on, and then obviously just put the dust cover, the plastic dust cover, back on the top before you start bleeding. Next up, you need your banjo and you need your copper washers. You put one washer on one side, then you put the banjo through the braided line or your existing brake lines, and then the other one on the back. Next up, you're just going to need to screw the banjo back in, making sure that you're careful that it's orientated correctly so it doesn't get tangled in the front wheel or the front suspension. Okay, so I've got a one-way non-return valve bleeder kit. You can see the valve is facing away from the caliper. You're going to need a 10mm spanner to undo the bleed nipple. Once that's slightly undone, you can go ahead and top up the reservoir at the top with fluid. Now, this is a really repetitive procedure. You want to make sure that you protect your bike and all your paintwork from any splashing brake fluid, because like I said, it's nasty and it will dissolve any paint that it comes into contact with. So once you've topped up the cylinder at the top, you want to loosen the bleed nipple at the bottom, push the brake all the way in to pump the air out, then tighten, then pump the brakes back out and repeat. So loosen the bleed nipple, push the brake all the way in, hold, tighten, release, pump, repeat. Now as you're doing this, the air is going to be pumped out, and so the cylinder at the top is going to pump the fluid down. So you need to make sure that you're watching at the top and topping it up as you need to. Now you'll know when you're finished, because all you'll get is you'll get additional pressure on the bar. All of the air will stop coming out and you'll just be pumping fluid through. So just make sure you save that fluid, because you'll need that again later on. When you're finished, just make sure the cap is on, tightened, and everything's cleaned. So one last job I've got to do before I finish is to replace one of the seals on the plunger just behind the brake lever. Now you might have seen this in episode 3. The existing seal that's in there, the dust cover, is absolutely knackered, so I've got myself another one of those. It was about 79p online, so I'm going to go ahead and replace that and then adjust the plunger. So there we go. So with the plunger reinstalled, I'm just going to push that in there, and then I'm going to put the brake lever back on, and then I'm going to adjust the span of the brake lever for play. So I've actually pulled the plunger quite far out initially, just to make it easier to reinstall. Once it's in, we'll undo that retaining nut, and then we'll adjust it using an Allen key. So at the moment you can see there's quite a lot of play here, so I want to adjust some of that out. So what I'm going to do is undo the nut on the back here, get an Allen key into the bolt, screw that in and check it for play. So you're looking for quite a bit of back pressure. I personally don't like a lot of play in my brake lever, but if you don't have any play whatsoever, you risk actually pushing brake fluid down into the caliper all the time and actually wearing your brakes out. So you just got to be a bit careful with this. Once you're happy, just need to redo the retaining nut back up again so that it doesn't loosen off in transit. As I was saying, any brake fluid that you've drained out of the system, make sure you save that, put that back into the brake fluid because you're going to need this later on to do the rear brakes. So before I reassemble the rear carriers, I've got to put the carrier back in, and to hold that in place, I'm just going to pop the rear axle in just to stop it from dropping out. Now I'm going to get my rear wheel and install that, making sure I've got the correct spaces on the wheel. I'm just going to slide that back in, push it right up against the back of the swinging arm before you put the rear axle through. Otherwise you won't have enough room to be able to pull the chain over the back sprocket. So as you can see here, with the wheel all the way forward, you should get enough slack to be able to pull the chain over the back of the rear sprocket. With the rear sprocket attached, I'm just going to slide the rear axle back through, and I'm just going to put the rear spacer and nut on just to hold the wheel in place so that I can locate the brake caliper on the other side. Same as before, I'm just going to grease up the backs of the new brake pads and install them into the caliper. I learnt my lesson this time. I haven't used anywhere near as much, but then again, the brake pads are half the size. Again, be careful not to get any of this grease on the brake pad, otherwise you will have no adhesion. Exactly the same setup. All you need to do is slot both the brake pads into the new refurbished caliper. The pin then gets pushed through over the top of the retaining clip to hold them in place. Okay, with the pin in place, I've just put the circlip on the back, and now I'm going to go ahead and put the dust cover back on. One problem I had with this bike to start with was the position of the banjo. So I bolted the banjo back on, but I've left it loose until I've bolted the caliper back on, just so that I can make sure I can position it correctly. There's two retaining bolts for the rear caliper, one with a nylock and one bolt straight into the carrier. Okay, now my caliper is in place. I'm just going to loosen off this clip. It holds the braided line in place, and I'm just going to loosen this off to give me the slack that I need to make sure that I can run the line up the correct route. That way it means that my banjo can be in a better position. So I'm quite happy with this position. It gives me access to the bolt with no interference, and later on I'll refit that mount and hold it in place. So I've got my bleed kit attached. The bleed nipple's on the back of the caliper on this side. It's quite difficult. You'll have to reach through the rear wheel to be able to access it. So I'm just going to go ahead and put some brake fluid in here. Once again, I would definitely recommend that you put a bit of old cloth around your reservoir just to stop any overspill from dripping down. As you pump the rear brake, it does have a tendency to squirt out. So same brake fluid as before. You've got to remember that the brake line to the rear wheel is quite a bit longer, so this whole process is going to take you about 45 minutes, but it's exactly the same. Open up the bleed valve, push the brake down, hold in place, lock the valve, pump, and repeat. This whole thing took me at least 45 minutes, so you need to be patient. It takes the actual master cylinder quite a bit of time to empty of air. And you can see all of the air coming out the other end here. So this is about half an hour in, you can still see bubbles coming out. It's quite an arduous process, so stick with it. It will eventually bleed all of the air out of the system. So same as before, when you're no longer pushing any air out of the system and you've got pressure on the footrest, you know you're good to go. So now we're just going to go ahead and tighten up the rear wheel and adjust this. So you can see the markers there. The markers are there to indicate that the wheel is aligned on both sides, so make sure you've aligned it correctly. Loosen it right off and push the wheel forward and adjust them together. You're looking for about 2.5 centimeters to 3 centimeters worth of movement in the chain. So as you start to adjust, you'll see the chain tighten up, but one thing you need to consider is when you actually do the wheel nut up, that will tighten the chain just a little bit more as well. And you're looking for a consistent 2.5 centimeters worth of movement. And as you can see, where my chain has been wrapped around the front sprocket for a year, I've got a tight spot, so it's going to take a little while for that to work out. Time for some high quality 2-stroke oil from Fuchs. So I'm just going to go ahead and pour this in. It will take more than this in total. Just make sure you're careful not to spill it anywhere. Unfortunately, as you're putting new oil in, it may push some air down into the system, so you can see an air bubble there, and that's a really simple fix. Just remove the cover from the oil pump, as you can see here. There's a bleed screw that you'll just need to undo slightly, and the gravity of the new oil will slowly push the air bubble down to the bleed screw, and you'll know when it's popped out because you'll see it fizz out of the bleed screw. So just tighten that back up, put the cover back on, and you should be good to go. Last thing I need to do is to fit my new fuel tap. So here's the old one. I just need to take the fuel line off by undoing the clip, and then I'm going to put that onto the new fuel tap and install it in my tank. Nice and straightforward fix. Just literally thread it gently back into the fuel tank through this hole, and then you just need to do up the two nuts, making sure that the rubber O-ring is seated properly, otherwise all of your fuel will leak back out afterwards on top of your engine, which won't be good. To reinstall the tank, you just need to reconnect the fuel line, making sure that the pinch clip is attached. Now this can be really fiddly, so you might want to lube the inside of the actual hose up with some oil or something similar to be able to slide it back on, because it's really difficult, but it needs to fit securely, otherwise you might get some fuel leakage. So what's next for the little RS125? Well, there's a couple of little niggly bits that I want to get sorted out. The chain roller is basically kaput, so I've ordered a new one of those, a couple of quid. And also the starter motor, I'm pretty sure is on its way out, so I need to replace that. There's a couple of bushes and a couple of bolts here and there that generally need replacing, but yeah, I'm looking forward to getting the bike MOT'd and getting it out on the road. So I guess the big question is, what's going to go over the top of it? What bodywork am I going to put on? And I'm not going to tell you that until the next episode, so you might have to wait a couple of weeks for that to be finished. But then, yeah, we're going to be out on the road doing a full review of it. So one more thing worth mentioning, you guys all saw me taking all the anodized stuff off, and I'm going to be giving that away to one of you guys to contribute towards one of your projects. And all you need to do for that is to go onto our Let's Review It Facebook page, like us and share us, and then send us a message to say that you've done it. And when I do the next episode, I'll be doing a draw and contributing that to one of your projects. So visit our Facebook page, Let's Review It, like and share the page, drop us a message, and yeah, who knows, you know, 30 to 40 quid's worth of stuff could be yours. And yeah, look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Take care.